Thalindra pressed the crystal stylus against the living parchment and watched her words sink into its surface like ink in the water. She was 3,000 years old, and she had recorded many things in her long life. She had written about the rise of empires and the fall of gods. She had documented plagues that swept across continents and wars that lasted centuries. But nothing had prepared her for what she witnessed today. Nothing had prepared her for the humans. The great archive of Silverleaf had sent her to observe the final battle. The void beasts had come from beyond the stars, creatures of pure darkness that consumed everything in their path. They had already devoured 6 worlds in this system. The Elven homeworld would be next, and after that, there would be nothing left. The combined forces of all races had gathered on the dead moon of Kethris to make their last stand. Elves, dwarves, orcs, and the younger race called humans had brought every warrior they could spare. Thalindra remembered how the elven generals had looked at the human soldiers when they arrived. The humans were so small, so fragile. Their lives lasted barely 100 years. They had no magic running through their blood. Their technology was crude compared to elven starships. The generals had placed them at the rear of the formation, expecting them to serve as a final reserve that would probably never see combat. Everyone knew the real fighting would be done by the elder races. The void beasts came with the setting of the twin suns. They poured through a tear in space itself, millions of them, each one a nightmare of teeth and shadow and hunger. Thalindra watched from her observation post on the ridge as the elven mages unleashed their most powerful spells. Beams of pure light struck the enemy lines. For a moment, it seemed like the battle might be won quickly. Then the void beasts adapted. They absorbed the magic and grew stronger from it. The dwarven artillery fired next. Massive shells filled with concentrated starfire exploded among the enemy ranks. The void beasts screamed, and thousands of them fell. But for every one that died, 10 more came through the tier. The dwarven guns grew hot and began to fail. The ammunition ran low. Within 3 hours, the artillery fell silent. Thalindra wrote everything down. She recorded how the Orcish berserkers charged into the enemy with their ancient war cries. She wrote about their courage and their fury. The orcs fought like demons, but the void beasts felt no fear and knew no pain. One by one, the Orcish warriors fell. Their green blood mixed with the black ichor of the enemy on the frozen ground. By midnight, the front lines had collapsed. The elven generals called for a retreat to the secondary positions. Thalindra could see the fear in their ancient eyes. They had lived for thousands of years, and now they faced extinction. Some of them began to weep. Others stood frozen, unable to accept that their immortal lives were about to end. That was when the humans moved forward. Thalindra had almost forgotten about them. They had been so quiet at the rear of the formation, watching and waiting. Now they marched past the retreating elves with a calm determination that made no sense. Their leader was a woman named Sarah Chun. She was 43 years old. By elven standards, she was barely a child. She walked at the front of her soldiers with a rifle in her hands and no expression on her face. An elven general grabbed her arm. His name was Cylindril, and he had commanded armies for 2,000 years. He told Sarah Chun that she was leading her people to their deaths. He said there was no hope. He begged her to retreat with the rest of them and find some way to escape, to survive, to carry on. Sarah Chun looked at him with eyes that seemed far older than her years. She said something that Thalindra would never forget. She said that her people had not come to survive. They had come to buy time. Every minute they held the line was another minute for the civilian transports to escape. Every human life they spent was another elven child who might reach safety. That was enough for them. Cylindril did not understand. He asked her why humans would die for people they had never met. He asked her what possible purpose their sacrifice could serve when the enemy was endless and victory was impossible. He asked her if she was not afraid. Sarah Chun smiled. It was a sad smile, but there was no fear in it, She told him that of course she was afraid. Every human on that battlefield was afraid. But fear had never stopped her people before. Humans had always been afraid of the dark, she said, but they had learned to make fire. They had always been afraid of death, but they had built civilizations anyway. Fear was just a feeling. It did not control them. They controlled it. Then she turned and walked toward the enemy, and her soldiers followed her. Thalindra watched what happened next through a haze of disbelief. The humans did not fight like the other races. They did not rely on magic or ancient weapons or legendary strength. They fought with coordination and sacrifice and a willingness to do whatever was necessary. When one soldier fell, another took their place. When a squad was overrun, they triggered explosives strapped to their own bodies, taking dozens of void beasts with them. They used their ships as weapons, flying directly into the largest enemy formations. Pilots who knew they would never return waved goodbye to their friends and accelerated into the darkness. Ground teams set up overlapping fields of fire and held positions long after they should have been overwhelmed. Medics dragged wounded soldiers to safety, even as void beasts tore at their flesh. Officers led charges into certain death without hesitation. 3 hours passed. The humans had lost half their number, but they had not retreated a single step. The void beasts began to focus all their attention on these strange creatures who would not run, who would not break, who seemed to welcome death if it meant killing one more enemy. The tier in space was still pouring out reinforcements, but now all of them were moving toward the human lines. Thalindra realized what was happening. The humans had made themselves into bait. They were drawing the entire enemy force toward themselves, away from the other races, away from the evacuation routes. It was a tactic of pure self-destruction, and it was working. Sarah Chun was still alive somehow. Thalindra could see her through her viewing crystal, standing on a pile of dead void beasts with an empty rifle in her hands. She was covered in black ichor and her own blood. One of her arms hung useless at her side. But she was still fighting, using her rifle as a club, smashing it into any enemy that came close. A young elven soldier ran toward the human lines. Thalindra recognized him as Cylindril's son, barely 500 years old. He had a healing crystal in his hands. He wanted to save the human commander. He wanted to help. Sarah Chun saw him coming and screamed at him to get back. She told him to run, to live, to remember what happened here. She said that someone had to tell the story. Someone had to make sure the universe knew what humans were willing to do for people they would never meet. The young elf hesitated. A void beast lunged toward him from the shadows. Sarah Chun threw herself between them. The creature's claws tore through her body, but her sacrifice gave the young elf time to escape. He ran back toward the elven lines, tears streaming down his face, clutching the healing crystal that would never be used. Thalindra watched Sarah Chun fall. She watched the other humans close ranks around their fallen leader and continue fighting. They sang as they died. It was a strange song, something about a home they would never see again, about people they loved who were waiting for them. The music carried across the battlefield, and even the void beasts seemed to pause at the sound. Dawn came 6 hours later. The human forces were gone. Every single one of them had died on that frozen moon. But they had held the line long enough. The civilian transports had escaped. The elven homeworld had been evacuated. Millions of lives had been saved because a few thousand humans had decided that those lives were worth more than their own. Thalindra put down her crystal stylus and wept. She was 3,000 years old, and she had never cried for anyone outside her own race. But she cried for the humans. She cried for Sarah Chun and her soldiers and every pilot who had flown into the darkness. She cried because she finally understood something she had never understood before. The other races had always looked down on humans. They were weak, short-lived, lacking in magic, primitive in their technology. They were the youngest race, the least important, the most forgettable. But Thalindra saw now that all of those judgments had missed the point entirely. Humans were not defined by what they lacked. They were defined by what they chose to do with what they had. In the face of certain death, the elves had wept and retreated. The dwarves had cursed and fallen back. The orcs had fought bravely, but ultimately fled. Only the humans had chosen to stand and die so that others might live. Only the humans had found meaning in sacrifice itself. Thalindra picked up her stylus again. She had a duty to perform. Future generations would read her chronicle and learn what happened on the dead moon of Kethris. They would know that the universe still existed because of the humans. They would know every name, every face, every act of courage. She would make sure of it. She began to write the names of the fallen. Sarah Chun, Marcus Webb, Yuki Tanaka, David Okonkwo, Elena Vasquez, James Kim. The list went on and on. Thousands of names that the universe might have forgotten if not for her chronicle. She wrote them all, and beside each name she wrote a single word in the ancient Elven language. The word meant hero. When she finished, she sealed the chronicle with her blood and sent it to the Great Archive. It would be copied and distributed to every library in the known worlds. Children who had not yet been born would read about the humans and their sacrifice. They would learn that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of it. They would learn that the value of a life was not measured in years, but in what a person chose to do with those years. Thalindra stood up and looked at the battlefield one last time. The bodies of the humans lay scattered across the frozen ground, still clutching their weapons, still facing the enemy. Even in death, they had not retreated. She made a vow to herself. She would live another 3,000 years if the universe allowed it. And she would spend every one of those years making sure that no one ever forgot what the humans did. She would tell their story to anyone who would listen. She would make sure that future generations knew the truth. The humans had not died so that they could be remembered. They had died so that others could live. But Thalindra would remember them anyway. It was the least she could do. It was the only gift she could give to people who had given everything. She turned away from the battlefield and began the long walk back to her ship. Behind her, the twin suns rose over the dead moon of Kethris, and the light fell gently on the bodies of the heroes who had saved the universe.